a decorated Canadian Air Force colonel, trusted with the nation's highest responsibilities, secretly lived a chilling double life of obsession, assault, and murder. This is the story of betrayal at the highest level, where power masked darkness, and the shocking truth stunned an entire country. Stay with us. In the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Ontario, Canada, few could have imagined that a decorated military officer, someone who had flown prime ministers and royalty, would become the center of one of the country's darkest criminal scandals. Colonel David Russell Williams was, on the surface, the embodiment of discipline, trust, and leadership. Born in 1963 in Bromsgrove, England, his family immigrated to Canada during his childhood, and he quickly adapted to a life of promise. His early years were marked by academic success and an interest in aviation, a path that would eventually lead him into the Canadian Forces. Those who knew him in his youth often described him as intelligent and quiet, a man who rarely courted attention but always seemed reliable. There were no obvious warning signs of the storm that would one day be revealed beneath the polished exterior. Williams enrolled in the Canadian military in the late 1980s and swiftly climbed the ranks. Colleagues and superiors respected him for his precision, work ethic, and ability to handle responsibility with apparent ease. By the late 2000s, he commanded CFB Trenton, one of Canada's most vital military airbases, coordinating missions that involved humanitarian aid, military logistics, and international flights. It was a position of immense trust, and with it came both prestige and power. Williams' role often placed him in close proximity to the country's political elite, and he became known for piloting flights that carried Canadian leaders as well as foreign dignitaries. To many, his career appeared flawless, and his calm demeanor only reinforced the impression of a man entirely devoted to service. Away from the base, Williams lived with his wife, Mary Elizabeth Harriman, a respected executive in the nonprofit sector. Their marriage appeared stable to outsiders. They owned a comfortable home in Ottawa and projected the image of a successful middle-class couple. Friends and acquaintances never suspected that Williams harbored a disturbing secret life. Behind the locked doors of his seemingly ordinary existence, he was cultivating obsessions that would gradually evolve into crimes of escalating severity. It began, quietly and almost invisibly, with acts of voyeurism. His first known incidents involved breaking into the homes of women in the surrounding Ontario communities. Williams carefully selected his targets, often choosing houses that appeared vulnerable or belonged to women living alone. He would slip inside, steal pieces of lingerie, and sometimes arrange the clothing in bizarre displays before photographing them. The images he kept, thousands of them stored on his computer, became trophies of his secret world. He also began photographing himself wearing the stolen garments, posing in ways that suggested both control and compulsion. What started as a fetish-driven thrill soon transformed into a pattern of repeated invasions, with Williams becoming bolder as he evaded detection. The victims of these early break-ins were unaware of who had violated their homes. Some women reported missing clothing, strange disturbances, or evidence that someone had been inside, but without clear suspects, the cases lingered unsolved. To investigators at the time, they seemed like isolated intrusions, frustrating but not urgent compared to violent crimes. Williams, meanwhile, refined his techniques. He learned to observe routines, to strike when his targets were away, and to retreat without raising alarms. Each successful break-in emboldened him, feeding the hidden side of his life even as he publicly maintained the persona of a respected military officer. By 2007 and 2008, Williams' behavior escalated further. He no longer confined himself to stealing clothing. He began staging encounters. He crept into bedrooms while women slept, photographing them in their most vulnerable states. In some cases, he tied them up, assaulted them, and documented the acts meticulously. Still, his victims often did not know who had attacked them, and the police struggled to connect the intrusions to a single perpetrator. The officer who commanded an airbase, who saluted the flag and carried the confidence of a nation, was simultaneously stalking women in the shadows of Ontario neighborhoods. As his compulsion grew, Williams' risk-taking increased. In November 2009, his secret life collided with his professional world in the most brutal way. Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a 38-year-old flight attendant with the Canadian Forces, was a subordinate under his command. Dedicated and admired by colleagues, she represented the integrity and professionalism that Williams himself pretended to embody. But for reasons that investigators later struggled to fully explain, he chose her as a target. Late one evening, Williams broke into her Brighton, Ontario home. What followed was an ordeal of terror. He restrained her, assaulted her, and recorded the events in photographs and video. Hours later, he killed her. Comeau's death shocked those who knew her. To her family, friends, and fellow service members, the loss was devastating. At the time, investigators had few leads. While suspicion loomed over the brutality of the crime, the idea that her own commanding officer could be responsible seemed unimaginable. Williams returned to work as if nothing had happened, maintaining his carefully curated image of composure and authority. Yet privately, he had crossed an irreversible boundary. He had moved beyond voyeurism and assault into murder, and the thrill of exerting life-and-death control over his victim left him craving more. Only weeks later, in January 2010, Williams identified another target, Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old civilian living in Belleville. He observed her home, studied her patterns, and eventually struck. Breaking in during the night, he restrained her, held her captive, and ultimately ended her life. Unlike in the Comeau case, Lloyd's disappearance immediately sparked alarm. Her family, friends, and community rallied together, searching desperately for answers. Police mounted an intensive investigation, canvassing the area, analyzing evidence, and setting up roadblocks. The community's fear grew as days passed with no sign of her. Williams, once again, tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, returning to the base and his duties. But this time, the investigation was closing in. Tire tracks discovered near Lloyd's home matched those of Williams' vehicle, placing him at the scene. Detectives arranged an interview, one that would unravel the double life he had worked so hard to conceal. Within hours of questioning, the mask of the respected colonel began to crumble, exposing the cold and meticulous predator that lay beneath. The revelations that followed would shake Canada to its core, not just because of the crimes themselves but because of who had committed them. The fall of a decorated officer, a man entrusted with national security and the lives of others, was more than a criminal case. It was a profound betrayal of trust. The interview that would bring Russell Williams' hidden life into the open began on February 7, 2010, inside a modest interrogation room at the Ontario Provincial Police Headquarters in Ottawa. The man sitting across from detectives was not a nervous suspect in shabby clothes. He was a colonel in full military bearing, a figure accustomed to command and composure. The lead investigator, Detective Sergeant Jim Smith, approached the conversation with calm professionalism. His method was deliberate, his tone steady, designed not to provoke but to create a space where the truth might eventually spill out. What unfolded over the next several hours became one of the most remarkable confessions in Canadian criminal history. At the outset, Williams denied involvement. He explained his presence in the Belleville area as coincidental, dismissing any suggestion that he had connections to Jessica Lloyd's disappearance. Yet Smith's persistence and evidence gradually eroded his facade. The breakthrough came when tire impressions collected near Lloyd's home were matched to Williams' vehicle, a Nissan Pathfinder. Presented with this evidence, Williams' carefully constructed world began to unravel. Smith pressed further, not with aggression but with a disarming quiet, suggesting that Williams had a choice. He could either drag the investigation through lengthy denials or he could admit the truth and retain some measure of dignity. What followed stunned even seasoned investigators. Williams began to confess, not only to the murder of Jessica Lloyd but also to the killing of Corporal Marie-France Comeau and to multiple sexual assaults and dozens of break-ins. He spoke with a chilling calmness, describing details of his crimes as though recounting routine tasks. He admitted to stalking women, breaking into their homes, photographing their clothing, and keeping meticulous records of his activities. Most disturbingly, he revealed the troves of photographs and videos he had stored on hard drives, documenting his actions with the precision of someone cataloging a collection. Investigators soon realized the scale of his hidden life. More than 80 home invasions were linked to him, stretching back years. He had broken into the homes of teenage girls, young women, and even older victims, each time taking souvenirs of lingerie and photographs. His confessions revealed a compulsive pattern of behavior that had escalated into violent assaults. In 2 cases, it had culminated in murder. For the detectives listening, it was a grim education in how far a seemingly disciplined man could descend into predation. The shockwaves extended far beyond the interrogation room. As news spread of his arrest, communities across Ontario were gripped by fear and disbelief. Neighbors who had once trusted Williams now realized he had prowled their streets, slipped into homes undetected, and violated the sanctity of private spaces. Fellow officers at CFB Trenton, who had admired his leadership, faced the devastating reality that their commander had been exploiting his position of authority while living a double life of criminality. For the families of his victims, the grief was compounded by the betrayal of trust. Marie-France Comeau's colleagues, especially, struggled to reconcile the fact that her killer had been her own superior officer. Jessica Lloyd's family endured the agonizing confirmation that her disappearance had ended in murder. For days they had clung to hope, organizing searches and appealing to the public, only to learn that their loved one's final moments had been marked by terror and violence. Their grief became a focal point of national attention, as Canadians across the country mourned with them. The sense of collective shock deepened as the details of Williams' double life became public. Media coverage intensified, dissecting every aspect of Williams' past. Journalists examined his military record, his personal life, and his marriage, searching for signs that might have hinted at the darkness within him. His wife, Mary Elizabeth Harriman, was thrust unwillingly into the spotlight, her life upended by revelations she had never suspected. Investigators cleared her of any involvement, but the public curiosity surrounding her marriage to a killer was relentless. She soon withdrew from public view, facing both personal devastation and widespread scrutiny. Williams' collection of evidence was perhaps the most disturbing element of the case. Police recovered tens of thousands of images. Photographs of lingerie neatly arranged, of Williams dressed in the stolen garments, of victims asleep in their beds, and of assaults in progress. The obsessive cataloging demonstrated not only his compulsions but also his meticulous nature. These were not impulsive crimes but calculated acts carried out with forethought and organization, revealing a man who had compartmentalized his deviance while maintaining a respectable public image. In October 2010, Williams stood in an Ontario courtroom to face justice. The proceedings attracted massive attention, with spectators filling the gallery and reporters lining up to cover every development. When prosecutors presented the evidence, the horror was undeniable. The photographs, videos, and Williams' own admissions painted a picture of a man who had not stumbled into crime, but had nurtured a secret life of exploitation and violence for years. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 82 counts of break-and-enter and theft. His demeanor in court was subdued, almost detached, as though he had already resigned himself to the inevitable outcome. For the families of his victims, the guilty pleas spared them the ordeal of a protracted trial, but they did little to ease the pain. Victim impact statements delivered in court laid bare the devastation left in his wake. Relatives spoke of shattered lives, of grief that would never fully heal, and of the incomprehensible betrayal by a man who had once represented authority and protection. Each statement underscored the human cost of Williams' crimes, reminding the court and the country that beyond the shocking headlines were real people whose lives had been destroyed. When the sentence was handed down, Williams received life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was the maximum penalty available under Canadian law, but for many, it felt insufficient compared to the gravity of his crimes. Stripped of his rank, dismissed from the military, and reduced to an inmate number, he entered the prison system as one of Canada's most infamous criminals. His former uniform, once a symbol of service and honor, was burned, an official act meant to erase his standing within the Canadian forces. The fallout from the case continued to reverberate. Within the military, questions arose about how such behavior had gone undetected in a senior officer. Were there missed signs? Could his crimes have been prevented? For the public, the case became a cautionary tale about appearances and the dangers of blind trust in authority figures. Communities once proud of their connection to the Air Force now struggled with the stain left by Williams' betrayal. Even as the trial ended, the shock lingered. Canadians had watched a man who embodied the nation's values of service and discipline fall to the depths of predation and violence. The story was no longer just about crime. It was about the fragility of trust, the duality of human nature, and the unsettling truth that even those who seem most honorable can harbor unimaginable darkness. In the aftermath of his conviction, the story of Colonel David Russell Williams did not end inside the courtroom walls. It lingered across Canada, in the homes of his victims, in the ranks of the military he once led, and in the collective memory of a public that had been stunned into disbelief. The case was not just about 2 murders and dozens of break-ins. It was about the shattering of an illusion. For years, Williams had presented himself as a man of impeccable character, a symbol of honor in uniform. Yet his crimes exposed the terrifying possibility that beneath the surface of authority and trust, monsters could exist unseen. The scars left by his actions would stretch far beyond the prison walls that now confined him. Inside Kingston Penitentiary, where he was first incarcerated, Williams faced a reality far removed from the life he once knew. Gone were the salutes, the crisp uniforms, the responsibility of commanding thousands of military personnel. In their place was the stark uniform of a convict, the clang of cell doors, and the judgmental gaze of fellow inmates who knew his story. His crimes, especially those involving women, placed him in a particularly vulnerable position behind bars. Guards and prisoners alike regarded him with a mixture of contempt and curiosity, aware that the man once entrusted with the safety of others had exploited that very trust in the most grotesque way. For the Canadian forces, the repercussions of the case were immense. Military leadership faced criticism for not detecting warning signs, for allowing a man leading a double life to rise to one of the highest and most sensitive posts in the Air Force. Reviews were launched to examine security protocols, psychological evaluations, and oversight procedures. Could the system have flagged his behaviors earlier? Could the warning signs, however faint, have been recognized before lives were lost? While investigations found little evidence that superiors had overlooked obvious red flags, the mere possibility haunted the institution. The betrayal by such a senior officer cast a long shadow over the reputation of the forces, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth that no system is immune to hidden corruption. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were left to rebuild their lives in the long shadow of grief. For the relatives of Corporal Marie-France Comeau, the pain was particularly cruel. She had trusted the chain of command, believed in the integrity of the institution she served, and yet had fallen prey to the very man sworn to lead her. For Jessica Lloyd's family, the randomness of her selection was unbearable. An ordinary young woman living in a small Ontario community, targeted simply because she had caught the eye of a predator. Their sorrow turned into advocacy, reminding the public of the need for vigilance, community awareness, and support for victims of violent crime. The broader public was left with haunting questions about human nature and the duality that Williams embodied. How could someone balance 2 such radically different identities? How could a man who spoke with discipline and authority by day prowl the neighborhoods at night, indulging in fantasies that escalated into brutality? Psychologists who studied the case suggested that Williams displayed traits of psychopathy, an ability to compartmentalize, to mimic normalcy while feeling little genuine remorse. His obsessive documentation of his crimes, thousands of photographs catalogued with almost military precision, demonstrated not only his compulsions but also his desire to relive his dominance over victims. Each image was a private victory, a way to preserve the power he had wielded in those moments of control. The marriage between Williams and his wife disintegrated quickly after his arrest. Mary Elizabeth Harriman, blindsided by the revelations, sought to distance herself legally and emotionally. She was granted a divorce and retreated into privacy, leaving behind the remnants of a life she thought had been built on stability. The public, however, remained fascinated with her role. How could she not have known? How could someone share a home with a predator and never glimpse the darkness? Those questions, though unfair, followed her long after she disappeared from the spotlight. Her situation underscored the collateral damage inflicted by Williams' crimes. Innocent lives shattered not only by violence but also by association. For law enforcement, the case became a textbook study in investigative persistence. The tire track analysis that linked Williams to the crime scene of Jessica Lloyd's disappearance became a critical turning point, an example of how small details can unravel even the most carefully maintained facade. The interrogation conducted by Detective Sergeant Jim Smith entered training manuals as a masterclass in patience and psychological strategy. By allowing Williams to confront the inevitability of evidence against him while maintaining calm and empathy, Smith coaxed one of the most extensive confessions in Canadian criminal history. The interview demonstrated that even the most controlled and disciplined suspects could be broken down through methodical questioning. As the years passed, the Williams case continued to surface in discussions about crime, authority, and the nature of evil. Documentaries revisited the story, piecing together the timeline of his double life. Books dissected the psychology behind his actions, and journalists explored the broader implications for trust in institutions. For Canadians, the story remained unforgettable not simply because of its brutality but because of the profound betrayal it represented. The colonel who flew dignitaries, who carried the flag of his nation abroad, was the same man who crept into bedrooms at night, stealing, assaulting, and killing. Williams' own demeanor after his conviction offered little comfort. He rarely spoke publicly and expressed no deep remorse beyond what seemed obligatory in court. The chilling calmness with which he confessed during interrogation lingered in the minds of investigators and the public alike. It suggested a man fully aware of his actions but emotionally detached from their consequences, someone who could describe a murder in the same tone used to recount a routine mission. This detachment only reinforced the image of a predator who had learned to mimic humanity without feeling it. Even now, long after his crimes, the name Russell Williams evokes unease. His story remains a cautionary tale about appearances, reminding society that trust should never be given blindly, and that evil can sometimes wear the most convincing masks. Communities in Ontario still recall the fear that swept through their streets when Jessica Lloyd disappeared, the shock that followed the arrest of a colonel, and the sorrow that settled in the wake of his sentencing. For the families of the victims, there is no closure, only the enduring ache of loss. Their loved ones will not return, their future stolen by a man who chose power and violence over humanity. As history records the case, it stands not merely as a catalogue of crimes, but as a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, authority, and the limits of trust. Williams' rise and fall remind us that evil does not always appear as a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it wears a uniform, smiles politely, and speaks with authority. It is this betrayal, more than anything else, that left Canada reeling and ensures that the story of Colonel David Russell Williams will never be forgotten. On a quiet July night in England, a former soldier turned predator shattered 3 generations of one family with a crossbow and knife. What began as love spiraled into obsession, control, and murder. This is the haunting story of Kyle Clifford and the lives stolen in silence. The summer of 2024 in England had begun like many others, with long days and warm evenings, but what unfolded in early July would etch itself into the memory of the nation as one of the most disturbing family tragedies in recent British history. It began quietly, in the suburbs near London, where an ordinary household carried on with the routines of daily life, unaware that a calculated storm was closing in on them. Behind the mask of normalcy, a man's growing obsession, anger, and inability to accept rejection were about to erupt into an act of violence that no one around him could have predicted in its full, chilling detail. That man was Kyle Clifford, a former soldier whose story would soon be tied forever to the deaths of 3 innocent women: his ex-partner Louise, her younger sister Hannah, and their mother Carol. Kyle Clifford was, on the surface, an unremarkable figure in his mid-20s. Friends and acquaintances remembered him as polite, but private and often withdrawn. His short-lived career in the British military had given him a sense of structure and identity, but once he left that world behind, he seemed to drift. Stability eluded him, and while others around him were finding their place in careers, families, and futures. Clifford was consumed by a relationship that had ended, but still dominated his thoughts. His relationship with Louise had once been intense, the kind that young couples often mistake for permanence. But underneath it was tension, control, and a possessive streak that grew stronger as time went on. When Louise decided to end it, Clifford could not accept her decision. For him, the separation was not just a personal loss. It was a challenge to his control, a rejection that his pride and fragile sense of self could not withstand. Louise, in her mid-20s, was described by her friends as gentle and thoughtful, with ambitions that extended beyond the walls of her family home. She wanted independence, space to grow, and freedom from a relationship that had begun to suffocate her. Ending things with Clifford had not been easy, but she believed it was the right step toward reclaiming her own life. Around her, she had the unwavering support of her younger sister, Hannah, and their mother, Carol. The three women shared not only the bond of family but also a closeness that many admired. Carol, in her 60s, was the kind of mother who always put her daughters first, guiding them with quiet strength and protecting them with every fiber of her being. Hannah, still in her early 20s, was fiercely loyal to her sister, often acting as a confidant and ally when Louise needed encouragement to stand firm. Together, they formed a small but strong unit, one that Clifford saw as a barrier between him and the woman he refused to let go of. As days turned into weeks following the breakup, Clifford's thoughts darkened. While outwardly he presented himself as just another young man trying to find his path, privately he was descending into resentment. He blamed Louise for leaving, he resented Hannah for always being by her side, and he viewed Carol as the guiding force who encouraged her daughter to escape him. Each of them, in Clifford's distorted perspective, had become an enemy standing in the way of his control. The breakup did not represent closure. Instead, it ignited a fuse. Clifford's military training had once been about discipline and defense, but now it provided him with the knowledge and confidence to plan something far more sinister. On July 9, 2024, that plan came to life. The day began with no outward sign of what was about to occur. Neighbors saw nothing unusual, and the family carried on with their routine inside the Hertfordshire home. But somewhere else, Clifford was preparing for a night that would devastate lives forever. He armed himself with a crossbow, a weapon chosen not only for its lethality but also for its silence, and carried a knife as well. His approach was not reckless. It was deliberate, almost rehearsed, the actions of a man who had envisioned this moment and was now stepping into the role he had cast for himself. That evening, as daylight faded and the quiet of night settled in, Clifford made his move. Entering the family's home, he brought with him a storm of rage, an intent that no one inside could have fully anticipated. Louise, the central target of his obsession, faced the brunt of his fury. His attack was not just about murder, it was about domination, humiliation, and retribution. In those terrible moments, Clifford raped her, a final act of violence that stripped away not only her life but also her dignity. Her sister Hannah, standing by her as she always had, tried to resist, but Clifford's determination was unrelenting. She became another victim of his wrath, her loyalty costing her life. Their mother Carol, whose instinct was to protect her daughters, was powerless against the weapons Clifford had brought. Her courage and love for her children could not shield them from the calculated brutality that unfolded before her. When the attack ended, 3 lives had been extinguished, leaving behind silence where once there had been warmth and laughter. Clifford fled the scene, disappearing into the night and sparking panic across the community. For neighbors, the horror was unimaginable. They had known the family as kind and ordinary, never suspecting that such violence could reach their doorstep. The killings were not random, not the result of chance, but of a deliberate vendetta born from rejection and obsession. The police response was immediate and massive. Word spread quickly that 3 women had been murdered in their home, and soon a manhunt was underway. Armed units, helicopters, and tracking dogs were deployed as Clifford moved through Hertfordshire and into North London, trying to evade capture. For the public, his background as a former soldier made the situation even more chilling. This was someone who understood weapons, tactics, and evasion. Authorities warned that he was dangerous and urged anyone who saw him to avoid approaching. The nation watched as updates unfolded, each headline reinforcing the horror of what had been done. By the time Clifford was located and arrested, the damage had already been done. The family was gone, their home turned into a crime scene, and a community left to grapple with the reality of how obsession and control could metastasize into something so destructive. The story was no longer just about one man and his failed relationship. It had become a wider commentary on domestic violence, on the dangers of unchecked obsession, and on the devastating ripple effect of a single person's choices. This was only the beginning of the story. In the days and months that followed, more details would emerge. The background of the relationship, the warning signs that had been missed, and the haunting testimonies that painted a clearer picture of the lives that had been stolen. For the families, friends, and neighbors left behind, the tragedy would never fade. And for investigators, prosecutors, and the public, the case of Kyle Clifford would stand as one of the most haunting examples of how personal vengeance can erupt into catastrophic violence, leaving behind scars that no verdict or sentence could ever fully heal. In the hours after the murders, the police investigation turned into a desperate race against time. News of the killings spread across Hertfordshire and quickly reached national headlines, with the public stunned at the brutality and the intimate nature of the attack. This was not a random act of violence, not a burglary gone wrong. It was a calculated assault that had wiped out 3 generations of a family in one night. For the detectives arriving on scene, the sight inside the home was almost unbearable. Louise, Hannah, and Carol lay lifeless, the silence of the house contrasting sharply with the terror that must have filled it just hours before. Every detail told a story of violence planned and executed with cold intent. The crossbow bolts, the knife wounds, the overturned furniture. All of it pointed to an intruder who had not acted in panic but had come prepared to destroy. The forensic team worked meticulously, collecting fibers, fingerprints, and DNA. They quickly confirmed what everyone suspected. The attacker had been Kyle Clifford, the ex-partner who could not accept rejection. Investigators traced his movements through CCTV cameras in the area, placing him near the house on the night of July 9th. Neighbors recalled hearing strange noises and described a man in dark clothing moving quickly through the street. It was not long before police released Clifford's name and photo to the public, warning that he was armed, dangerous, and on the run. The manhunt became one of the largest seen in recent years. Armed response units swept through Hertfordshire, checkpoints were set up on roads leading to London, and helicopters scanned open fields and wooded areas. Clifford's military background made him a uniquely difficult suspect to catch. He knew how to move without drawing attention, how to survive outdoors if needed, and how to use weapons effectively. The police feared he might strike again, especially if confronted. Public warnings urged people to stay indoors if they believed they had seen him. Every few hours, new reports appeared in the media, each one building tension across the nation. People wanted to know not only where Clifford was, but also why he had chosen such a brutal method of violence against those he once shared a home with. As the manhunt stretched into the next day, detectives dug deeper into the story behind the killings. They pieced together the troubled history between Clifford and Louise. Friends and colleagues revealed how the relationship had soured, how Louise had confided that she felt controlled and pressured, and how she feared Clifford's temper. Though she had broken off the relationship, his presence continued to loom over her life. There had been no restraining order in place, no formal report of threats, but those closest to her said the warning signs had been there. Clifford was described as obsessive, checking on her movements, questioning her friendships, and resenting her independence. The breakup had not ended his control. Instead, it became the final trigger for his violence. Louise's sister, Hannah, emerged in the narrative as a loyal defender of her sibling. Investigators learned how she had stood beside Louise during arguments, how she encouraged her to stay strong and not give in to Clifford's attempts at reconciliation. To Clifford, Hannah became more than just an obstacle. She represented defiance. By supporting her sister, she was, in his mind, fueling the resistance against him. Carol, the mother, played an equally crucial role in Louise's independence. A loving and supportive parent, she had always placed her daughter's safety first. Friends recalled how she had gently but firmly advised Louise to move on from a relationship that was no longer healthy. Clifford, already nursing resentment, saw Carol as the person who gave Louise the strength to leave him. To a man consumed by control, each of these women became a symbol of opposition, and on that night in July, his attack was aimed at erasing them all. The choice of weapon became a disturbing focus of the investigation. Clifford had used a crossbow, a weapon not commonly seen in violent crimes. Forensic experts explained that crossbows were not only lethal but also silent, making them tools of precision rather than impulse. The fact that he had paired it with a knife suggested forethought. He had prepared for resistance and ensured he had multiple means to carry out his attack. This was not the chaos of a man who lost control in the moment. It was the execution of a plan that had likely been forming in his mind for weeks. When Clifford was finally located, it was the culmination of intense surveillance and tracking. Armed officers closed in on an area of North London where he had been spotted. The arrest was tense but swift. Police moved in with full tactical preparation, mindful that he might still be armed with the crossbow or other weapons. Clifford did not resist in a dramatic standoff but was subdued and taken into custody, ending the 24-hour reign of fear that had gripped the region. His capture brought relief, but it did not ease the sorrow that hung over the community. The three women were gone, and nothing would bring them back. As the legal process began, prosecutors assembled a case that left little doubt about Clifford's guilt. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA from the crime scene, witness accounts, CCTV footage, and forensic proof tying him to the weapons. But beyond the physical evidence, what haunted those who followed the case were the emotional details. The final hours of Louise, enduring not just murder but sexual assault, highlighted the cruelty of Clifford's intent. The loss of Hannah and Carol revealed the ripple effect of domestic violence, how it does not stop at the partner but can engulf entire families. In court, Clifford's demeanor drew attention. Some described him as detached, almost cold, while others said he seemed aware of the gravity of what he had done. There was no plea of innocence. Instead, the proceedings laid bare the story of a man who allowed obsession and pride to spiral into horror. Witness testimonies painted a fuller picture of the victims. Louise as kind and determined to take control of her life, Hannah as protective and vibrant, and Carol as nurturing and courageous. Each story was a reminder of the human lives behind the headlines. The trial also raised wider questions about how society responds to controlling relationships. Could more have been done to protect Louise and her family? Were there missed opportunities to intervene? Advocates against domestic abuse pointed to the need for greater awareness, stronger protective measures, and recognition that emotional control and obsession can be precursors to extreme violence. Clifford's case became more than just an individual tragedy. It was a cautionary tale about the lethal potential of unchecked control in relationships. By the end of 2025, Clifford was convicted on all counts, 3 murders, rape, and related charges. The sentence was long and uncompromising, ensuring that he would spend most, if not all, of his life behind bars. But for the families and communities left behind, justice could never undo the loss. 3 women had been taken in a single night, leaving an empty house, grieving relatives, and unanswered questions about how love had turned into violence so complete. The story of Kyle Clifford had begun as one man's inability to let go, but by now it was clear that its impact stretched far beyond him. It was a story of family bonds shattered, of a community left in mourning, and of a society forced to confront the dangers of obsession that turns deadly. And though the trial closed the legal chapter, the emotional wounds it left behind would take far longer to heal. The conclusion of the Kyle Clifford case marked the end of a legal battle, but for those who had been touched by the tragedy, there was no sense of finality. The sentencing in 2025, which condemned Clifford to spend his life behind bars, did not erase the horror of that July evening. Instead, it became a moment of reflection, an opportunity for the public, the media, and the justice system to take a closer look at what had gone so catastrophically wrong and how a private relationship had spiraled into a crime of such magnitude. Courtrooms, though built to deliver justice, can never fully answer the deeper questions about human behavior, obsession, and violence. And so, what lingered after the trial was not just the knowledge of Clifford's guilt, but the haunting understanding of the lives that had been lost and the lessons that demanded attention. During the sentencing hearing, victim impact statements were read aloud, each one echoing the devastation left behind. Extended family members spoke of the emptiness of losing not one, but 3 loved ones in the same night. Friends described Louise as someone who had wanted nothing more than to live freely, without fear or control. They remembered Hannah as a young woman with promise, laughter, and loyalty, and Carol as a matriarch whose greatest joy had been to raise her daughters. Their words filled the courtroom with raw grief, a stark reminder that the victims were not just names in a headline, but people whose absence had left a permanent void in the lives of those who loved them. Clifford himself offered little in the way of explanation or remorse. Observers noted his lack of visible emotion, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed, as though he were somewhere far away from the reality of the proceedings. Psychologists later debated whether his behavior reflected denial, cold calculation, or the mental collapse of someone unable to confront the enormity of his actions. But for the families and the public, these speculations mattered little. What mattered was that he had made a choice, that his actions had been deliberate, and that his punishment would ensure he would never again walk free to harm another person. The trial and conviction also reignited national conversations about domestic violence and coercive control. Advocates pointed out how often stories like Louise's begin quietly, with patterns of jealousy, possessiveness, and monitoring that can escalate into violence when not addressed. In Clifford's case, the signs had been subtle at first: arguments, pressure, and inability to accept boundaries. By the time Louise ended the relationship, those behaviors had solidified into obsession. The tragedy underscored the urgent need for better systems of support for victims who sense danger even before physical violence begins. It highlighted that emotional and psychological abuse is not just damaging but can act as a precursor to far greater harm. The use of a crossbow in the attack also sparked debate over weapon regulation in the United Kingdom. Crossbows, unlike firearms, were not as tightly controlled, and while incidents involving them were rare, the Clifford case demonstrated the devastation they could cause in the wrong hands. Legislators began discussing whether tighter restrictions or licensing requirements should be introduced. The haunting detail that 3 women had been killed in their own home by a weapon most people associated with sport or hobby served as a chilling call for action. In the media, the case took on the weight of a cautionary tale. Documentaries, investigative programs, and newspaper features sought to explore the layers of the tragedy: the psychology of control, the strength of the victim's family bond, and the failures in recognizing the danger before it escalated. The narrative that emerged was not sensationalized but deeply sobering. It was a reminder that behind closed doors, in ordinary houses, dangerous dynamics can exist unnoticed until it is too late. Experts interviewed in the aftermath emphasized that obsession, once it takes hold, can lead individuals to plan violence with chilling precision, and that awareness and early intervention are crucial in preventing tragedies like the Clifford murders. For the local community in Hertfordshire, the wounds remained raw. Vigils were held outside the family's home, flowers and candles placed as a mark of respect. Neighbors spoke of the kindness of Carol, the energy of Hannah, and the quiet determination of Louise, and they struggled to reconcile the image of their peaceful street with the reality of what had taken place there. The home itself, once filled with life, became a symbol of loss, its silence echoing far louder than any words could. Schools, workplaces, and local groups connected to the family all mourned together, the shock binding them in shared grief. As time passed, the story shifted from immediate horror to lasting memory. Annual tributes were planned to honor the lives of the 3 women, and charities against domestic abuse drew strength from their story to campaign for greater protections. Their names became part of a broader movement, ensuring that their deaths would not be forgotten but would instead drive change. The Clifford case, tragic as it was, began to serve as a catalyst for education, awareness, and reform. Yet, on a personal level, the tragedy remained immeasurable. Those closest to the victims described how ordinary moments now carried extraordinary weight: birthdays without them, holidays missing their presence, and quiet evenings that once would have been filled with laughter, but were now marked by silence. The intergenerational loss of mother and daughters in a single night was almost too much to process. Friends often said that the hardest part was knowing how much potential had been cut short. Louise's ambitions, Hannah's future, Carol's years of wisdom and love. These were not just stolen lives but stolen futures. In reflecting on Kyle Clifford's actions, commentators often returned to the theme of choice. He was not a man caught in a sudden moment of passion. He was a man who chose to prepare, to arm himself, and to carry out his plan. The deliberate nature of the attack was what made it so haunting. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that violence born from control and obsession is rarely spontaneous. It is calculated, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when the perpetrator decides to act. By the time the case closed, one thing was clear. The Clifford murders would stand as one of the most notorious examples of domestic violence in recent British history. It was not a war crime or a battlefield tragedy, but something that unfolded within the walls of a family home. And that, perhaps, was what made it so unsettling. The story reminded everyone that danger does not always come from strangers or distant conflicts, but can rise from the people once welcomed into our lives. People whose love curdles into control, and whose control transforms into lethal violence. The final words of the judge during sentencing echoed the weight of this truth. He described Clifford's actions as cold, premeditated, and devastating in their impact, and acknowledged the courage of the victims in standing together, even in their final moments. Justice, he said, could punish the offender, but it could never restore what had been taken. It was a sobering reminder that the law can only go so far in repairing the damage left behind. And so, the story of Kyle Clifford closes not with resolution but with remembrance. A former soldier whose inability to accept rejection led to one of the most brutal family killings the country had seen. 3 women whose lives embodied love, loyalty, and courage, stolen in an instant, and a society left to grapple with the lessons of obsession, control, and the urgent need to protect those at risk. The house in Hertfordshire may one day fade from headlines. The trial may become a matter of record. But the names of Louise, Hannah, and Carol endure. They are remembered not for the way they died, but for the lives they lived, and in that memory, their story continues to resonate. A warning and a legacy written in grief but carried forward in hope for change. In 2012, a young mother vanished in a Kenyan town after a night with British soldiers. Months later, her body surfaced in a hotel septic tank. For over a decade, silence shielded the accused. Now, as justice nears, the world demands answers. This is Agnes Wanjiru's haunting story. Nanyuki, a bustling garrison town tucked along the foothills of Mount Kenya, has long been known for its vibrant nightlife and its proximity to the British Army Training Unit. Soldiers came and went with regularity, their presence both a source of income and tension for the community. In March 2012, on a night that would forever change the lives of one family, 21-year-old Agnes Wanjiru walked into the Lions Court Hotel with her friends. For most people, it was just another evening in Nanyuki. A mix of laughter, cheap drinks, and music that pulsed late into the night. For Agnes, it was an escape from her daily struggles, a few hours away from the endless responsibility of motherhood, and perhaps a fleeting moment to feel young again. Agnes was a single mother to an infant daughter named Stacy. She lived with her sister Rose, who often took care of the child when Agnes worked as a hairdresser or stepped out for the evening. To those who knew her, Agnes was vibrant and hopeful, but also weighed down by the financial burden of raising a child alone. Friends described her as soft-spoken, sometimes shy, but with an infectious smile that could light up a room. Like many young women in Nanyuki, she was drawn into the orbit of foreign soldiers who frequented local hotels and bars. These encounters were complicated, sometimes transactional, sometimes social, but always marked by a power imbalance between local women and the uniformed men who treated Kenya as temporary ground for training and leisure. That night at Lions Court, witnesses saw Agnes mingling with a group of British soldiers from the Duke of Lancaster's regiment. Among them was a man who stood out, taller, heavier, exuding the kind of confidence that came with military camaraderie. They laughed, drank, and spoke in hushed tones. To the local patrons, this was not unusual. British soldiers were often seen in the company of Kenyan women. But what stood out, and what several witnesses later remembered, was Agnes leaving the bar area with one of the soldiers, disappearing into the direction of the guest rooms. It was around midnight, the music still loud, the drinks still flowing. None of her friends saw her return. The next morning, Agnes did not come home. Rose grew worried almost immediately. It was unlike her sister to vanish without word, especially with her infant daughter waiting for her. Hours stretched into days and days into weeks. Rose and other relatives searched Nanyuki, asking questions at hotels, bars, even police stations. The British soldiers had already rotated out of town. The absence of answers deepened the family's dread. By then, whispers were spreading. People had seen Agnes with a soldier, they had gone to a room together, and then she was simply gone. Yet, without a body, without proof, those whispers remained just that. Rumors swirling in a small town where gossip often outpaced justice. It wasn't until 2 months later that the truth began to surface. At Lyons Court Hotel, a foul stench had been haunting staff. A gardener tasked with maintenance discovered its source. A septic tank, sealed and sunken into the hotel's compound. Inside, in the darkness, was a body in an advanced state of decomposition. The remains were soon identified as those of Agnes Wanjiru. The discovery was as horrifying as it was devastating. For her family, hope of finding her alive collapsed into grief. For Nanyuki, it was a chilling confirmation of what many had already suspected. The condition of her body told a brutal story. A post-mortem examination revealed stab wounds to the abdomen and blunt force injuries to her chest. Forensic experts suggested she may have still been alive when her body was dumped into the septic tank, left to die in silence beneath the ground. The indignity of it all, a young mother discarded in such a way, shook the community. But as her family mourned, they also began to question why justice seemed so slow, why the men last seen with her had already vanished back to the United Kingdom. Rose stepped into the role of caretaker not only for Stacy but for the memory of her sister. She refused to let Agnes become just another forgotten victim. Day after day, she visited police stations, pressed authorities for answers, and spoke to anyone who would listen. Alongside her, Agnes's niece Esther began to find her voice, carrying the story of her aunt into the public sphere. But for years, their efforts were met with silence. Investigations opened and closed, files were reported missing, hotel records disappeared. The case seemed buried under bureaucratic delays and a reluctance to confront the involvement of foreign soldiers. Behind the silence was a complex web of power and politics. The British Army had a long-standing presence in Kenya, and its training unit was considered essential for both military preparedness and diplomatic ties between the two countries. To accuse a British soldier of murder was not just a legal matter. It was a political storm waiting to happen. And so, while Agnes's family grieved, the machinery of justice stalled. Witnesses who spoke of seeing her with soldiers were left unheard. Hotel staff who remembered unusual events that night were overlooked. And every passing year felt like a cruel reminder that Agnes's life, to those in power, was disposable. Yet, in the streets of Nanyuki, her story lingered. Locals remembered the young woman with the bright smile, the young mother who had her whole life ahead of her. They remembered the soldiers who came and went, their laughter echoing in the bars while the mystery of her death remained unresolved. Rose and Esther kept telling her story, ensuring that even as officials tried to move on, Agnes would not be forgotten. By 2019, an inquest in Kenya finally reached a conclusion that the family had known in their hearts since 2012. Agnes had been unlawfully killed. The inquest named British soldiers as responsible, but even then, no charges were filed. It was justice in words, but not in action. For Rose, it was another bitter reminder of how slow the path to accountability could be. The face of her sister appeared on news broadcasts, on faded posters, in conversations whispered in bars and cafes. But the soldier who was last seen with her remained unnamed to the public, living freely far from Nanyuki. As the years dragged on, Stacy grew from a baby into a child without a mother. Rose carried the weight of responsibility, not just raising her niece but keeping alive the demand for justice. In the quiet moments of the night, She often wondered if her sister had been scared in those final hours, if she had fought back, if she had cried out for help that never came. Those questions haunted her as much as the lack of answers from authorities. The story of Agnes Wanjiru was no longer just a tragedy of one family. It had become a symbol of something larger. It reflected the painful imbalance between local communities and the foreign soldiers who treated their town as a playground. It reflected a system where evidence vanished, where files went missing, and where accountability was endlessly delayed. But beneath all the politics and power, it was still the story of a young woman who wanted nothing more than to provide for her daughter and carve out a better future. As the decade neared its close, the memory of that night in 2012 still lingered. A young woman had walked into a hotel full of laughter and music, and never walked out again. A family had been left to raise her child and fight her battles long after she was gone. And somewhere, far from Nanyuki, a soldier carried secrets that the world had yet to uncover. The discovery of Agnes Wanjiru's body in the septic tank of Lions Court Hotel was not only a moment of horror for her family. It was the beginning of a long battle with institutions that seemed determined to bury her story as deeply as the ground that concealed her. The postmortem confirmed what no one wanted to imagine, that her death had been violent and cruel. Stab wounds and blunt force trauma painted the image of a struggle, a life brutally cut short. For Rose and the rest of her family, grief quickly collided with frustration. They had expected that once her body was found, police investigations would lead directly to those responsible. But the opposite happened. Silence, delays, and vanishing evidence. In the weeks following the discovery, police statements were contradictory. Witnesses who had seen Agnes leave with a soldier were interviewed, but their testimonies did not result in swift action. The hotel, which should have been sealed off as a crime scene, continued to operate, and in the chaos, records and evidence disappeared. Room bookings that might have connected a soldier to Agnes went missing. Even the septic tank, which could have been meticulously examined for DNA or clothing fibers, was left contaminated. Each oversight deepened suspicion that the case was being mishandled, whether by incompetence or design. For the British Army, the death of a young Kenyan woman was an inconvenient scandal. The soldiers stationed in Nanyuki were quickly rotated back to the United Kingdom. The very men who had been at Lions Court that night were gone, their departure leaving investigators chasing shadows. Families in Nanyuki whispered that the soldiers had been protected, shielded from accountability by the weight of diplomatic ties. For Rose, the silence from authorities felt like betrayal. She had buried her sister in the red earth of central Kenya, yet she could not bury the questions that haunted her. Who killed Agnes, and why was no one answering for it? As the years passed, the case slipped into obscurity. Agnes became another statistic, her story confined to fading police files. But her family refused to let her memory vanish. Rose spoke often about Agnes's daughter, Stacy, who was growing up without knowing the warmth of her mother's embrace. Every milestone in Stacy's young life, a first word, a first step, was shadowed by the absence of Agnes. For Rose, raising her niece was both an act of love and a constant reminder of the injustice still unresolved. In 2019, a flicker of progress appeared. After 7 long years, a Kenyan inquest was held. Forensic evidence, witness statements, and the circumstances of Agnes's death were revisited in a courtroom. The ruling was unequivocal. Agnes Wanjiru had been unlawfully killed, and the British soldiers were responsible. The conclusion was both vindication and torment. It validated the family's cries for justice, but no individual soldier was charged, no extradition request was made, and no one was brought before a court to answer for the crime. It was a judgment without consequence. For the family, it felt like justice was always within sight but never within reach. The inquest, however, reignited public debate in Kenya. Journalists, activists, and citizens began to question why the case had been allowed to languish for so long. They asked why the British Army had not cooperated fully, why hotel records had vanished, and why the Kenyan authorities had been so slow to act. For some, Agnes's death became symbolic of the broader power imbalance between Kenya and the United Kingdom, a reminder of colonial shadows where the lives of locals could be disregarded in the face of foreign power. Behind the headlines, the family continued their fight. Esther, Agnes's niece, grew into a young woman determined to keep her aunt's name alive. She spoke publicly about the case, addressing media and community forums, reminding everyone that Agnes was not just a victim but a mother, a sister, a daughter. She described her aunt's laughter, her dreams of providing for her child, her resilience despite hardship. Her words humanized Agnes in a way that official reports never could. While the inquest was a turning point, it was also a sobering reminder of how fragile justice could be. The family had expected that naming British soldiers as responsible would force the hand of both governments. Yet the silence persisted. In Nanyuki, life moved on, soldiers returned for training cycles, and the Lions Court Hotel continued to operate, haunted by its dark history but rarely spoken of openly. Then came 2021, nearly a decade after Agnes's death, when investigative journalists unearthed explosive new evidence. Reports emerged of leaked WhatsApp chats between soldiers who had been in Nanyuki in 2012. In these chats, some soldiers allegedly mocked Agnes's death, with one openly boasting about her killing. The messages reignited public outrage. Suddenly, Agnes's story was back on the front pages of international newspapers, and the silence that had protected the suspects began to crack. Among the revelations was the repeated mention of one soldier's name, Robert James Purkis, a medic from the Duke of Lancaster's regiment. He was the man other soldiers had identified as the last person seen with Agnes on that fateful night. For years, his identity had remained hidden from public view, but now the world knew. For the family, it was a breakthrough they had been waiting for, proof that someone could be held accountable. For Purkis, it was the beginning of being dragged into the spotlight for a crime he had evaded for so long. The story of Agnes Wanjiru began to spread far beyond Nanyuki. In the UK, members of parliament raised questions about the conduct of soldiers abroad and the culture of silence that allowed such crimes to go unpunished. Human rights organizations demanded that the UK cooperate fully with Kenyan authorities. International media painted a grim picture. A young mother murdered, her body hidden in a septic tank, and a decade of inaction by powerful institutions. But even as outrage grew, the path to justice remained uncertain. Would the UK extradite one of its former soldiers to face trial in Kenya? Would the Kenyan government persist in its pursuit of the case? Or would it once again falter under diplomatic pressure? These were questions that haunted not only the family but also the Kenyan public, who saw in Agnes's case a reflection of how ordinary citizens could be abandoned when power and politics collided. For Rose and Esther, the resurgence of the case was both painful and hopeful. It reopened wounds that had never truly healed, forcing them to relive the night Agnes disappeared and the moment her body was found. But it also gave them renewed energy to fight. Agnes's daughter Stacy, now old enough to understand fragments of her mother's story, grew up hearing her name not as a forgotten victim but as a woman whose memory inspired a movement for justice. The years of frustration, the vanished files, the lost evidence, all seemed to lead to a single question. Would anyone ever be made to answer for what happened in Nanyuki in 2012? As the case gained global attention, the pressure mounted. Governments could no longer look away, and the soldier once shielded by silence was now facing the weight of international scrutiny. The stage was set for the next chapter. It would take more than anger, more than words. It would take legal action, political will, and the courage of a family who refused to let Agnes's story die. By 2025, more than 13 years after Agnes Wanjiru's life was violently cut short, her story had traveled far beyond the borders of Nanyuki. What began as a local tragedy had become a global scandal, exposing uncomfortable truths about military culture, international accountability, and the way justice can be delayed for the powerless. For her family, every passing year without answers had felt like a cruel extension of the crime itself. But in September 2025, the silence was broken in a courtroom in Nairobi when Justice Alexander Mutebi issued a formal arrest warrant for Robert James Purkis, the former British Army medic named repeatedly as the soldier last seen with Agnes on the night she disappeared. The announcement electrified Kenya. For years, Whispers about British soldiers and their role in the killing had lingered like smoke over Nanyuki. But now, the Kenyan courts had taken decisive action. Purkis was to face a murder charge, and Kenya confirmed its intention to seek his extradition from the United Kingdom. For Rose, who had lived through more than a decade of grief and stonewalled investigations, it was a bittersweet moment. She had carried her sister's story in her heart for so long, telling it to journalists, to officials, to anyone who would listen. But now it was being carried onto the global stage, where it could no longer be ignored. The impact rippled quickly through both nations. In Kenya, newspapers ran front-page headlines with Agnes's smiling face, reminding readers of the young woman who had once been just a hairdresser and a mother but had become a symbol of resilience against injustice. Commentators spoke about the case as a test of Kenya's sovereignty. Could the nation compel a former soldier from one of the world's most powerful militaries to face justice on Kenyan soil? In the UK, the case provoked uncomfortable debates. Politicians were pressed on whether the UK should honor the extradition request. Human rights advocates pointed to the hypocrisy of championing international law abroad while shielding one of their own from accountability. The military, meanwhile, faced fresh scrutiny over its culture of silence, where soldiers' jokes in leaked messages revealed a callousness that shocked the public. For Purkis, who had long lived quietly in Greater Manchester, the news shattered the illusion of escape. His name, once buried in legal files and anonymous testimony, was now spoken on international broadcasts. He was no longer a shadow in the background of a cold case. He was the accused. Whether guilty or not, he was now the man upon whom a decade of grief and rage was being directed. And for the family of Agnes, that was at least a beginning. A chance to see him answer in court for the crime they had never doubted he committed. Yet even with the arrest warrant, nothing was simple. Extradition was not immediate, and in diplomatic corridors, the case became a matter of negotiation. Would the UK hand over Purkis, or would it insist on a trial within its own borders? Skeptics warned that politics could still derail the pursuit of justice, just as it had for more than 10 years. But for the Wanjiru family, this was not a moment for hesitation. They prepared themselves for the possibility of reliving every painful detail in court. The night Agnes disappeared, the condition of her body, the testimonies of soldiers, the years of waiting. They had carried this burden for too long, and if it meant enduring it once more, they were ready. The voice of Agnes's daughter Stacy, now a teenager, added a new dimension to the story. For most of her life, her mother's presence had been a memory carried through photographs and stories told by her Aunt Rose. But now, Stacy spoke publicly, saying she wanted justice not just for her mother but for herself. She wanted answers for why she had grown up without the woman who gave her life. Her words cut through the layers of legal argument and diplomatic debate, reminding everyone that this was not only a case about law and politics but about human loss. The trial, if it comes to fruition, will not only weigh the guilt of one man but will force institutions to confront their failures. The Kenyan authorities will have to explain why files went missing, why hotel records vanished, and why it took nearly a decade for an inquest to even declare Agnes's death unlawful. The British military will have to reckon with how its soldiers behaved in Nanyuki, why their testimonies and leaked chats showed more contempt than conscience, and why one of their own could evade accountability for so long. For the public watching in both countries, the courtroom could become a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, neglect, and whose lives are deemed worthy of justice. For Rose, the journey has been long and filled with sorrow. She has raised her niece as her own daughter, all while keeping alive the memory of her sister. She has faced officials who dismissed her, journalists who sensationalized her pain, and years of silence from those who should have acted. Yet through it all, she has refused to let Agnes be forgotten. Her persistence is what carried the case from a septic tank in Nanyuki to the docket of the Kenyan High Court. And as she prepares to see the man accused of killing her sister finally face the law, she knows this fight has never just been about Agnes. It has been about dignity, about proving that a young Kenyan woman's life mattered just as much as anyone else's. As October 2025 approaches and the case edges closer to trial, the world waits. There is anticipation but also caution. Too many times before, the Wanjiru family has seen hope snatched away at the last moment. They know that political pressure, diplomatic hesitation, or legal technicalities could still stand in the way. But they also know that this moment is different. The story is no longer hidden, no longer confined to Nanyuki or whispered conversations. It is being told in headlines, debated in parliaments, and followed by audiences around the world. Whether or not a conviction is secured, one truth has already been written. Agnes will not be forgotten, and her death will not remain buried in the shadows. The final chapter of the story has yet to be written, but it is clear that the world is watching. The fight for justice for Agnes Wanjiru has become more than the pursuit of one killer. It has become a demand that no life, however humble, can be dismissed. As her family waits for the next court date, they hold on to the hope that what began with tragedy may finally end with justice.